A pilot made a series of reckless mistakes and he got his two daughters and their friend killed on what was supposed to be a routine flight over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. Unfortunately, there's a lot more to this story, and that's why I'm going to explain the mistakes that were made and how this tragedy happened. But be sure to stick around because I'm also going to share with you a very powerful story about a pilot in a similar situation and how he managed to survive. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on Saturday, November 26, 2011, when a pilot and three passengers took off from the Marion Municipal Airport in Indiana to take a short 90-minute flight to the DuPage Airport in West Chicago, Illinois. For what it's worth, the same trip can be driven in about 4 hours, which is something you need to keep in mind when you hear about what happened during the flight. That being said, Ray was 46 years old and he was the pilot flying the plane. Traveling with him was his oldest daughter, Rami, who was 21. Sitting next to her was her sister, Shay, who was 20 years old. Also on board was Shay's boyfriend, Chris, and he was 22 years old. The Thanksgiving holiday was over, and the purpose of the trip was to take Rami to college, and then they were going to head back home. Ray earned his private pilot certificate in April of 2010 with about 70 hours of flight time, most of which was logged in a Cessna 172. Then a few months later, he started flying a Cirrus SR20, and he would go on to log 114 hours in that aircraft over the next year and a half leading up to the accident. But we're going to talk more about that in a minute. According to his logbook, Ray had 3.1 hours of simulated instrument time and 28.6 hours flying in actual instrument conditions. However, for every flight in which he logged actual instrument time, the time entered in his logbook was equal to the total time for the entire flight. That meant he was claiming he was in the weather the entire time on all of those flights, which was most likely not the case. So the problem is we don't really know for sure how much experience or training he had flying in the weather, and it's frustrating that his instructor allowed him to log the flight time like this. And just as a quick side note, the investigation also discovered that Ray logged at least 38 hours of flight instruction that wasn't endorsed by a flight instructor. Regardless, Ray logged about 207 hours of total flight time, including 153 hours as pilot in command. And even though he had over 100 hours in the Cirrus, the last time he logged instrument time was in February of 2011, which was 9 months before the crash. The Cirrus SR20 that Ray was flying is arguably one of the most popular aircraft on the market today, and it's well known for its safety features, including an airframe parachute system. However, Ray was flying one of the very first SR20 models that were built back in 2000, and the interior doesn't look anything like the SR20s that are being sold today, and the avionics and safety features in the newer aircraft have changed quite a bit over time. In fact, when we look at Ray's aircraft, it's important to understand that it was equipped with a Garmin GNS 430. This is a small display that basically provides you with navigation and communication capabilities, and it's what he was probably using to help navigate during the flight. The big screen on the main instrument panel is called an ICDS 2000, and it integrates with the Garmin, and it's essentially a moving map display with airspace information that makes it a lot easier to see everything. And then for his primary flight instruments, Ray had a basic 6-pack configuration directly in front of him that he could easily reference throughout the flight. The other thing worth pointing out is that the aircraft had a fully functional autopilot that was capable of reducing pilot workload through all phases of flight in the weather. The only problem is that because the NTSB didn't talk to Ray's flight instructor, we have no idea how familiar he was with the autopilot or any of the other avionics in the aircraft. That being said, when it comes to Ray's training, according to his logbook, he did 3 flights in the SR20 for about 5 hours of flight time, and then he was pretty much done with his training. Now, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I've had a few flights as a passenger in an SR20, and I'd argue that it's one of the safest aircraft on the market today, but only when you take the time to get the proper training. But the thing is, back in 2010, when Ray was getting checked out, the training with Cirrus wasn't anywhere near as structured as it is today, which is something that's definitely going to play a role in this crash. The important thing to keep in mind, though, was that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. On the morning of the tragedy, Ray, Ramey, Shay, and Chris showed up at the Marion Municipal Airport planning on a 9 a.m. Central Time departure, and the flight to DuPage was only supposed to take about an hour and a half at most. Now, you need to know that this wasn't Ray's first time flying into DuPage. In fact, he had been there at least 5 times in the past year in the Cirrus. However, it had been at least 6 months since his last visit. So the conservative thing for him to do would be to review the flight plan, the airfield procedures, and the weather before the trip. According to an eyewitness, Ray asked for his plane to be topped off with fuel. When he arrived at the airport, Ray was asked about his destination, and Ray said that he knew about the weather to the west of Chicago, but the forecasted weather for his time of arrival was VFR, and that was part of his decision to leave when he did. However, it's worth pointing out that potentially adding to the pressure to make the trip happen, allegedly someone found in the wreckage a ticket for an Indianapolis Colts football game for Sunday, the day after the crash. Now, I don't know if that's true because it wasn't confirmed by the NTSB, but I'm sure that Ray probably felt some pressure to make the flight happen. Either way, the fact that someone was asking him about the weather should have made him at least think twice about what he was doing. That's because the truth is there was an area forecast in effect for northern Illinois all morning, predicting broken to overcast clouds from 1,500 to 2,500 feet, with another overcast layer from 4,000 up to 26,000 feet, calling for IFR conditions with rain showers and mist. Additionally, the DuPage forecast, which was published at 6 a.m., was predicting that by 10 a.m., when Ray would be landing, that the weather would be 6 miles visibility due to light rain and mist with broken clouds at 2,500 feet and overcast at 3,500 feet. Now, even though that's technically marginal VFR conditions, Ray probably assumed it was going to stay that way and he could just fly under the weather, and he probably didn't even think to look at anything else. In fact, there was no record of him contacting flight service for a weather briefing prior to the flight. I also just want to point out that a lot can change in 4 hours from the time that forecast was issued until the time he was going to land, so he should have gotten an update prior to takeoff and during the flight as well. Instead, Ray told everyone to hop in the plane so they could go. According to the radar data, the flight was relatively uneventful for about the first hour. Ray was consistently holding an altitude of 2,400 feet, reflecting the possibility that he was using the autopilot, at least in some capacity, to help him during the flight. That should have been plenty of time during the first portion of the flight for him to call flight service on the radio and get an update on the weather, or at least get the ATIS from DuPage, or talk to the controller along the way to make sure the weather was still VFR. That's one of the things that I've talked about a lot on this channel. It's staying ahead of the aircraft and knowing what's coming up next and being prepared for it. However, there's no evidence that Ray did any of that. Instead, as Ray got closer to DuPage, he began a descent to about 1,600 feet, and when he was 2 miles south of the airport, he finally called the control tower and said he was coming in and wanted to know if visual flight rules would be available for landing. That's when the controller told him that the field was IFR and asked him to say his intentions. Okay, there's a few problems with this. First of all, the DuPage Airport is Class D airspace, so you need to establish two-way radio communication with the tower before you enter the airspace. That doesn't mean wait until you're 2 miles away and then call the tower and ask if you can come in. Second of all, I'd argue that this was a pretty reckless mistake because he could clearly see the weather out in front of him, and he didn't even try to turn around or avoid it. In fact, if you look at his radar track, I think he had his GPS set up to bring him to a 5-mile final, because that's where he turned to the north to head towards the runway. Also, I think he was probably flying just below the clouds at 2,400 feet, but the clouds started sloping down, so he turned off the autopilot and started descending. That's how he got down to 1,600 feet. And my guess is that he was looking for the airfield and trying to find a way to get under the weather, and he lost all situational awareness of where he was. And that's why he flew into the tower's airspace without talking to them. But here's the thing, if Ray had gotten a weather update during his flight, he might have learned that 45 minutes before he got to DuPage, the forecast was updated and predicting 5 miles visibility with overcast clouds at 800 feet. And according to the investigation, by the time he arrived, it was overcast at 900 feet with 3 miles visibility. In fact, the weather was so bad that a few seconds later, Ray apologized to the controller, saying that he just overflew the airfield because he didn't realize he was going that fast. The controller was a little surprised by this and reminded Ray it was IFR and asked him again to say his intentions. Unfortunately, that's when everything started to fall apart. All right, I want to pause the debrief for a second because I want you to imagine something. What if your address, phone number, and even details about your family were being sold online without your knowledge or consent? Unfortunately, thanks to data brokers, it's happening right now. Now, I've talked about data brokers before on this channel. These are the companies that scour the internet compiling massive profiles on you, and then they sell that information to anyone willing to pay for it. That's why I personally use and recommend Delete Me. Their privacy experts search for my personal data across hundreds of data broker sites, and they work to get it removed. Since I started using Delete Me, they reviewed over 15,000 listings, and they found 76 data brokers with my information that they work to have removed from me, and they continue to monitor those sites and work for me all year long. The reason this is so important is because when that information is out there, you're at a higher risk for things like phishing scams, harassment, or even identity theft. And I'll be honest, it's not just me I'm worried about, it's my family members. That's why I like the fact that Delete Me has a family plan, so you can help protect the ones you care about the most. And if you value your privacy as much as I do, whether you're protecting yourself, your family, or both, you can get 20% off consumer plans if you just scan the QR code on the screen, or you can go to joindeleteme.com/debrief and use the code debrief to get 20% off. And thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the debrief. When the controller asked Ray to say his intentions, that would have been the perfect time for him to ask for help and admit that he's a VFR-only pilot with limited instrument experience, and he needs to find a place to land that's VFR. Instead, Ray said, if it's IFR, we're going to move on. I was just checking. I went down to about 2,000 and could see pretty well, so I was just going to see if you were available. The controller then asked if he wanted to land at DuPage, and after Ray said that would be wonderful, the controller had to ask him 3 times if he had the field in sight before Ray finally said, yeah, we just flew past it. That entire conversation took place when Ray was just to the west of the field, and the controller ended up telling him to just make a right 180 and he could land on runway 20 right. Now, I'll admit it's possible that Ray had the field in sight for a brief moment, but when he initially turned to the left, that put the airport at his 6 o'clock position where he couldn't see it. And now he's turning back to the right, and he was about 4 miles away and he lost sight of the airport. That's when he told the controller that they were going to go back out to the north and make a straight in. The controller gave him a suggested heading and asked Ray again to say his intentions. One of the reasons why the controller is asking him this is because of something called a special VFR clearance that allows a pilot to operate under VFR rules even when the weather is below VFR minimums. All you need is at least 1 mile visibility, and you have to remain clear of clouds. However, the pilot has to request it. The controller can't ask you if you want it or recommend it to you, but they can ask you to say intentions. However, special VFR clearances are usually best for situations where you have some sort of localized weather that's hovering at the airport, and it's not something you want to use to try to scud run or push the limits in bad weather conditions. Either way, Ray never asked for a special VFR clearance. Instead, he turned to the north and asked if there was an airport close by that had better visibility because he didn't want to get in there and get stuck all day. That last statement right there shows you where his focus is at right now. He's not worried about finding a way to land. He's thinking about potentially getting stuck at the airport if the weather gets worse, even though he could always rent a car and drive home if he needed to. As Ray continued northbound, the controller asked him if he wanted to talk to approach so that way they could help him with vectors, but Ray said no, and then the controller told him that the best weather in the area was at Chicago Executive, which was reporting 1,500 overcast and 10 miles visibility. This is not a good situation to be in, and Ray didn't have a lot of options, but the best thing he could probably do right now is forget about landing in DuPage and instead just get the wings level and turn on the autopilot and ask for help. That's what the controllers are there for. Trust me, they don't want you to crash and die. Just explain what's going on and ask for help. Instead, Ray continued to the north, and there was a short conversation about whether he was familiar with the Class Bravo airspace because Chicago Executive sits just to the north of O'Hare International underneath the Class Bravo. and the controller asked him again if he wanted to talk to approach to get some suggested headings to fly. But for some reason, Ray said that he was still trying to decide if he wanted to try to land at DuPage or not, and he even asked the controller if he thought it was a good idea. Let me be perfectly clear. No, it's not a good idea. Ray is a VFR pilot and DuPage is 900 feet overcast. Chicago Executive isn't that much better at 1,500 feet, but it's the best option for him in the area. And to be honest, if he had just turned on the autopilot and put the Marion Municipal Airport back in his GPS, he probably had more than enough fuel to go back home where it was VFR. But at this point, he's trying to find a way to land at DuPage regardless of the risk. This is where I thought the controller did a great job, because he asked if Ray was VFR and if he was in the clouds. And when Ray responded saying he was in and out of the clouds, the controller asked if he was IFR qualified, and Ray said, "I'm in IFR training and I've let this get around me." That was all the controller needed to hear to realize the situation was much worse than he thought. Tragically, Ray and his daughters and their friend only had about 20 minutes left to live. This image shows you the flight radar data, and a few minutes after the controller realized that Ray was a VFR-only pilot, he told Ray to switch frequencies to talk to the approach controller to get more help. For the next 4 minutes, neither one of the controllers could get a hold of him on the radio, and I think that's because Ray was still in the weather and he was doing everything he could to maintain control of the aircraft. He still wasn't using the autopilot as he flew to the south, and he struggled to control his altitude before eventually turning to the west, probably hoping for some clear airspace. When Ray finally checked in with the controller, he was told once again that Chicago Executive was overcast at 1,500 feet and DuPage was overcast at 900 feet. Then there was some confusion because Ray said he wanted to go back to DuPage, and when the controller reminded him that it was IFR, Ray finally agreed that he would go to Chicago Executive. Alright, I want to pause for a second because I think this is a great example of continuation bias. If you're not familiar with that, it's when someone has an unconscious bias to continue with the original plan in spite of changing conditions. Now, in Ray's situation, perhaps he felt pressure to drop off his daughter at school, or maybe he was worried he would get stuck and not make it back home. Who knows? Either way, he was focused on landing at DuPage and he didn't have a contingency plan. Once he got in the weather, his workload increased, which made it very difficult for him to recognize the circumstances had changed, even though it was obvious to an outside observer. The radar data looks like he was trying to maneuver the aircraft to remain VFR, even though he was probably still going in and out of the clouds. He eventually turned back around and headed up to the north, starting to make his way towards Chicago Executive. Then around 10:22, the controller said, "Let me know when you can navigate direct to Chicago Executive." And Ray told him, "At this point, I don't want to mess with the weather. I'm going to get out and I don't want to get stuck in there." He then told the controller that he's navigated out of the airspace, and the controller told him the frequency change is approved. That was the last radio call that Ray ever made. Before I explain what happened next with Ray, someone that watches my channel reached out to me recently with a very personal story. And because it was so similar to Ray's situation and I thought it was such a powerful story, I asked them if I could share it with you. So as you listen to this, I want you to think about what you would do in the situation and how it compares to what happened to Ray.
I was in a situation yesterday where if I obeyed all of my natural senses, I would have killed my family. We were flying up north, me and the family. Weather was fine. Ceilings were a little low, so the overcast was about 2,500 feet. So we're cruising up there about 2,000 feet. You know, it was only a 40-minute flight, not too bad at all. We get within 5 minutes of the airport that I was supposed to land at. And the weather, no rain, no thunderstorms, nothing like that, but this cloud moved in so fast, it was phenomenal. There's no way we're going to be able to land at this airport. No way. And so I did a 180 like you should. I am a VFR pilot, so I can only fly if I can see. Legally, I cannot fly in the clouds. I have to get an instrument ready to fly the clouds. But by the time I turn around to head back to Flint, we're already completely engulfed in this cloud. So basically, we are straight IFR, instrument flight rules. I can't see anything out the cockpit. It's completely white. We're in this white cloud. Completely white. We can't see nothing. Within the first minute of being in that cloud, I'd lost about 300 feet of altitude. and we are in a 25-degree bank, and I didn't even know it. My senses didn't know it. I had no clue. So here I am looking at these instruments. I'm like, you know what? If I don't do something fast, I'm going to kill me and my family. I took the stick. I began to line the plane back up to get it straight and level. And I tell you what, I was so disoriented, had no sense of direction, that it was going against the grain, going against every natural instinct I have to line this plane back up. Because my instruments tell me to do this. And as I do this, my natural senses are telling me we're going to flip this plane over or we're going to crash if you do that move. As I, line the gauges back up, we begin to circle around. Now, I didn't declare an emergency, but I did call 121.5, which is an emergency station for pilots. And I said, you know what? I'm a VFR pilot. We are in complete IFR. You need to vector me, or you need to get me to the closest airport where there's VFR or visual flight rules so I could see to get this plane down. They sent me to Saginaw. That was a big airport that was very close to me. And they're like, you know what? We have good weather here. We want to vector you to Saginaw. Now, I've heard this a lot. And me personally, I've even made fun of pilots. I'm like, how on earth could a pilot get in this condition and all you got to do is look at your gauges? It's very simple. There's a little line your airplane up to this little line, and it's simple. But I tell you what, as of Friday, I completely understand how you can be disoriented in an aircraft because your natural senses are telling you, no, these gauges are wrong. These gauges are wrong. Go with your senses. But that's not right. So I make one more turn around, and I told Sagan, I was like, all right, I'm going to turn around one more time, and then I'm going to head your way. Now, I was not looking forward to flying. It's about a 20-minute flight. I was not looking forward to flying 20 minutes through that cloud, but you know what? That's the closest weather. That's good. That's where I need to go. Because I had my whole family on board, my wife and both my kids. As I make that last turn to head towards Saginaw, I mean, this is a God thing. There was because like I said, we're circling above an airport. Not our original destination. We're about 10 miles east of our original, but we're circling over Gladwin. And as I did that, boom, Gladwin opens up. And I was like, you know what? There's my shot. I'm going down right now. So we went down, smooth landing, touchdown in Gladwin. And so we got down to Gladwin, and it felt good to get back on the ground. But as I look back, and I tell you what, if you get in IFR conditions, complete whiteout, you can't see nothing, and you have to fly by your gauges, if you don't trust them gauges and go with your natural senses, you're going to crash and burn, just like in life. Thank you for the time. God bless.
I want to personally say thanks to Bill for allowing me to share his story, and I'm sure there are countless other pilots that have stories just like that and they've managed to survive, but when it comes to Ray and his daughters and their friend, they weren't as fortunate, and that's why these debriefs are so tough. Unfortunately, Ray made a series of reckless mistakes that he couldn't recover from. By the time Ray told the controller he was leaving their airspace, he had been flying around in and out of the weather for almost 30 minutes and he didn't have a plan. He was still thinking about getting stuck somewhere, and he was probably so mentally exhausted that he didn't even think to turn the autopilot on. He started a right-hand turn and became spatially disoriented and lost control of the aircraft. 2 eyewitnesses watched in horror as the plane exited the bottom of the clouds in a 60 to 70 degree nose-down attitude until it clipped a tree and crashed in a field, killing everyone on board. The parachute that you see in the wreckage photos was dislodged from the aircraft when they struck the tree, and there was no evidence to prove that Ray had tried to pull the handle and deploy it, even though tragically if he had done so when they were still wings level at 2,000 feet, they'd all most likely still be alive today. I hope you found this debrief helpful and were able to learn something from it, and if you did, then be sure to check out this other one on the screen. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you on the next pilot debrief. Thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. To get your data removed from the internet, check out Delete Me using the link in the description and get 20% off.